The name Chickamauga already carries with it a weight of death. A name whispered with dread in both Union and Confederate camps. In 1863, the fields and ravines along that river became soaked in blood where tens of thousands clashed in one of the war's most brutal encounters. But some survivors swore there was something else on that ground. Something older than the war, older than the land itself. They did not speak of cavalry charges or cannon fire. They spoke of a shadow that moved when no man moved. A ripple that cut through fog and brush, as if the earth itself was alive. One soldier, his letters stained and creased, wrote that he saw the hill breathe. Another recalled that during a lull in battle, the men heard a long, low hiss that silenced even the birds. They thought it was steam from a ruptured cannon until the earth shifted beneath their feet. What they glimpsed just for a moment was not smoke nor dust nor mist. It was scales, dark, wet, glistening as if from the underworld itself. Some newspapers hinted at the reports tucked into the corner columns between casualty lists. One line read, "A singular disappearance of 3 pickets has been reported." Some attribute their fate to no known enemy of flesh and blood. But then, nothing. No follow-up. No official record. The incident was swallowed as quickly as the men themselves, and yet stories linger. Men at campfires whispered of a giant serpent that slid through ravines. Its body longer than a line of artillery, its head broad as a man's chest. In the moonlight, its coils gleamed like iron plates. To see it was to feel madness. To hear its hiss was to believe the battlefield itself had become cursed. When the war ended, Chickamauga was already a place haunted by the dead. But those who walked its ravines at night swore the ground remembered, and that in certain fogs the serpent still moved. Letters, fragments, half-burnt journals all hint at something extraordinary, something never explained. It was not the war that frightened me most, one survivor wrote, but what lay beneath it. A battlefield where thousands perished, and in the shadows of that slaughter, a creature beyond reason. A serpent of extraordinary size that perhaps has never left. September 18th, 19th, and 20th, 1863. Northern Georgia along the banks of Chickamauga Creek. The ground trembled under the weight of men and horses, the air filled with the constant thunder of cannon and the cracking of musket fire. More than 100,000 soldiers converged here, Union General William Rosecrans pressing South Confederate General Braxton Bragg, desperate to halt him. The result was a storm of violence, a clash so ferocious that by the time it ended, Chickamauga was etched into history as one of the war's most dreadful killing grounds. The name itself carried an omen. Chickamauga, from the Cherokee tongue, often rendered as the River of Death. For some soldiers, the name was just a coincidence until they walked the terrain. Ravines cut through the land like scars, dark gullies that swallowed sound, twisting paths that seemed to lead men in circles. Thick forests blocked the sky, muffling the battlefield into a world of smoke and shadow. It was easy to vanish here. Regiments were known to drift apart, swallowed by trees and fog, emerging hours later, disoriented or not at all. Survivors wrote of the uncanny geography. Captain Henry Stone of the Union recalled in his diary, "The woods twist upon themselves, and every ravine feels like a throat waiting to swallow men whole." Confederate scouts warned new troops not to venture into the gullies at dusk. One report filed to headquarters described the singular disappearance of 3 pickets along the lower creek, fate unknown. No bodies were recovered. No shots were heard. They were simply gone. And yet, even as the fighting raged, soldiers whispered that Chickamauga's unease went beyond tactics and terrain. They told each other of the strange fog that rolled low across the ground, clinging to the hollows long after the sun rose, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Men claimed they heard noises within it, an echo like the sliding of chains, or the hiss of something alive, massive, moving through brush unseen. The locals, those who had lived near the ravines before the armies arrived, already carried their own legends. They spoke of deep cuts in the land where the Cherokee once warned their children not to wander. They said the fog was a veil, and that sometimes it revealed things best left forgotten. Even before the first shot was fired, Chickamauga was whispered of as a place not entirely of this world. Now, in September of 1863, it became more than a haunted landscape. It became a slaughterhouse. Nearly 35,000 casualties in just 3 days. Men torn apart by canister shot, cavalry charges broken in half, entire brigades vanishing into the smoke. And woven into this chaos was another thread one never entered into the official reports but found in scattered letters and journals. Stories of something vast moving through the ravines. Stories of a serpent that seemed to belong not to this century nor to any century known. The story of Chickamauga in the official record is one of maneuvers and casualty lists, of brigades broken and generals blamed. Yet buried inside these dry documents are curious threads lines that catch the eye, phrases that do not belong in the language of military dispatches. Words like singular disappearance, words like fate unknown. On September 20th, 1863, Colonel Charles A. Dana, serving as an observer for the Union War Department, noted that confusion reigned on the battlefield. Units vanished not only into the fog of war, but into the ravines themselves. Reports of men missing without wounds, without witnesses, were scribbled hastily and sent to headquarters. Some were dismissed as desertion. Others were recorded more cautiously. One note read simply, 3 men detached to guard the ravine did not answer roll call. Their rifles were discovered still loaded. No tracks of pursuit. Confederate records hold similar oddities. In General Bragg's correspondence, one subordinate officer remarked upon strange losses unaccounted for among his pickets. Another dispatch from Colonel Trigg described uncommon markings in the soil impressions wide and serpentine leading nowhere. These words remain in the archive, never clarified, standing stark against the backdrop of tactical orders and casualty numbers. Civilian newspapers, especially those near Louisville, Nashville, and Chattanooga, caught wind of whispers. The Louisville Daily Journal included a small column almost buried beneath casualty reports. A mysterious occurrence is rumored upon the field at Chickamauga concerning the sudden vanishing of men in the ravine country. No explanation has yet been put forward, though speculation is rife. A rival paper went further, suggesting that superstition already grows among the camp's tales of some monster inhabiting the dark gullies. But these reports were short-lived. By the following week, they were gone, replaced with political speeches and casualty lists. Letters from soldiers, however, are harder to silence. Corporal James Weaver of the 15th Indiana wrote home on September 22nd. The woods are ill, the ravines breathe. We thought we saw smoke drifting against the wind, low and coiling. Henry went to look. He did not come back. We searched and found his bayonet bent, his musket dropped, nothing else. Private Edward Norris of Tennessee scrawled a line in his diary before he himself was listed as missing. I heard it last night, a hiss long and low, like steam through a fissure. But it came from the ground itself. I dared not go nearer. God keep us. His diary was found later in the mud near Kelly Field. The last entry smeared his fate unrecorded. Testimonies conflict, but converge in unease. Some describe a tremor beneath their feet as though the very earth shifted. Others tell of fog that rolled in thick when there was no reason for fog, clinging to hollows and gullies long after sunrise. A Union lieutenant sketched rough lines in his notebook, scribbling beneath them. Like coils, but not possible. The drawing remains in his papers filed away in the National Archives. There is also the matter of the journals that never survived whole. Fragments have turned up, half-burned letters, brittle diary leaves with words hastily crossed out. In one fragment, the words can just be made out, "We saw the serpent," before the ink trails into nothing. And then there are the silences reports that should exist, but do not. Entire patrol logs missing from regimental archives. Morning reports filed with gaps where names should be. Officers complaining in correspondence that the record is incomplete. Patterns emerge only when these fragments are placed together. Men vanish without trace. Weapons found abandoned. Impressions in the mud described as wind and unusual serpentine, not of hoof nor boot. Hissing in the night fog that moves against the wind. Official dispatches that end abruptly. Diaries that stop mid-sentence. All these things add up to something more than coincidence. A battlefield of confusion, yes. A slaughterhouse of men, certainly. But also a place where events crossed into the inexplicable. The official reports could not say it. The generals would not say it. But the soldiers themselves did. They gave it a name in whispers passed from fire to fire. The Serpent. Long before cannon thundered in the valleys of Chickamauga, the land itself had a reputation. The Cherokee who lived and hunted along these creeks spoke of dark ravines where spirits moved like living mist. They called the place Chickamauga, a name the soldiers of the Civil War would later echo as the River of Death. For generations, elders warned their children, do not wander when the fog is thick. Do not follow the voices that call from the gullies, for something waits there. Something older than any tribe, older than any battle. When the war came, the superstitions did not vanish. They adapted. Farmers who fled the area as the armies closed in told soldiers strange things. They said the fog along the lower creek rolled in, even on days of clear sky. They said deer would not graze near the ravines, and dogs would not enter the woods. One old woman in a tale carried second-hand into soldiers' letters told of a great coil in the ground that sometimes shifted underfoot when men cut wood or drew water. The soldiers, of course, laughed at first. Young boys from Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana, Virginia, they mocked the idea of a phantom serpent. But laughter fades quickly on a battlefield where men disappear without trace. When 3 pickets vanished near the southern ravine, their posts found empty rifles still loaded. No sound of a fight, men stopped laughing. Instead, they whispered. Stories spread from campfire to campfire. Some said the serpent was seen gliding across the moonlight, its coils thicker than tree trunks, moving with an unnatural silence. Others told of a patrol that stumbled upon a shed skin thin translucent, stretched across brush like canvas, larger than any known beast. One man claimed he heard it crackle in the wind, as if still alive. No one ever produced this skin, and yet the rumor was repeated until it became fact in the minds of many. Superstitions multiplied with every night spent in those woods. Confederates began refusing to stand watch near certain ravines. Union soldiers admitted to firing blindly into the fog when they heard what they swore was a hiss, not the hiss of steam, not the cry of shells, but the long, steady exhalation of something alive. A sergeant from Kentucky wrote in his diary, "We felt as though the ground had a pulse, and in the fog we saw arcs dark as iron, moving as if with breath." He never elaborated. Other accounts drifted further into the realm of the ghostly. There were whispers of men dragged into the ground, their screams muffled beneath the soil. Tales of patrols returning pale, unable to speak, their eyes wide as though they had seen something they could not name. In one Confederate regiment, it was said a soldier was found dead with no wound upon his body, but his face contorted in terror, his eyes staring wide at nothing. His comrades whispered that he had seen the serpent in the fog. As decades passed, the folklore only deepened. Survivors carried the stories home with them. In Tennessee, an old veteran told his grandchildren that Chickamauga was cursed, that he had once seen eyes in the woods, larger than lanterns, watching from the mist. In Ohio, a soldier supposedly told his church congregation that hell itself rose in the shape of a serpent during the battle, and he would never forget the sound of it sliding through the trees. By the early 1900s, locals living near the battlefield told ghost seekers and curious travelers that Chickamauga was haunted not only by the spirits of the fallen, but by the guardian serpent. They called it sometimes the devil's snake, sometimes simply the Chickamauga serpent. Children were warned not to stray into the ravines, especially when the fog settled low. Park visitors in the mid-20th century spoke of strange movements in the corner of their eyes, of heavy rustling in the brush, when no animal could be seen. Even into modern times, the echoes remain. Paranormal investigators claim to hear unexplained hissing, recorded on night audio. Visitors walking the trails speak of shapes too long and too fluid to be human. A ranger interviewed off-record admitted that on quiet evenings he heard something like chains dragging in the leaves, but smoother like a sliding weight. He refused to call it a serpent, but his description matched the old tales. And so fact bleeds into folklore, and folklore back into fact. Official reports whisper of mysterious occurrences, letters speak plainly of fog that moves like a living thing, and ghost stories keep the legend alive more than a century later. What began as scattered accounts of vanishing men has become something larger, the story of a presence that dwells in Chickamauga still. A serpent of extraordinary size, a phantom of the battlefield, a reminder that some mysteries linger long after the cannons fall silent. Chickamauga, a name heavy with blood but also heavy with whispers. And those whispers, when unraveled, do not belong to Georgia alone. They echo across other battlefields in other centuries, like a refrained disappearances without a trace, figures seen, and then gone sounds with no source. Mysteries that cling to places where men fell in terrible numbers. At Gettysburg, a year before Chickamauga, the stories are not only of Lee Meade or Pickett's charge. There are stories of Devil's Den, a labyrinth of stone where men died by the thousands. Decades after the battle, visitors and photographers told the same tale again and again. Faded soldiers in gray uniforms, gaunt faces asking for directions as if lost, and then vanishing when the witness looked back. Photographic plates, when developed, revealed figures no one had seen at the moment of exposure, faces pressed into the glass uniforms, out of time. Some dismissed it as a trick of light or a flaw in the emulsion. But those who believed in the echoes of the battlefield whispered otherwise. Gettysburg never truly sleeps. At Shiloh on the Tennessee River, diaries carry the same chill. Soldiers wrote of comrades who stepped into the woods and did not return. No shots fired. No bodies found. Their muskets discovered still loaded, abandoned in the leaves. Officers recorded them as deserters, tidy explanations, convenient lies. But the men who served beside them insisted otherwise. They said the fog came down and the earth seemed to breathe. One diary describes strange lights glowing beneath the soil lanterns that drifted below the ground, and cries that seemed to rise from nowhere. The final line ends with 3 words, only fate unknown. And across the ocean in the First World War, the same pattern. Gallipoli, 1915. The Norfolk Regiment, hundreds of men marched into a low-lying cloud, clinging to the ground. They entered the mist, and they did not come out. No graves, no bodies, no certainty. Witnesses swore they had been swallowed whole by the cloud itself. History calls it confusion, misplacement, annihilation. But the legend remains the Phantom Regiment. Listen closely to the words that survive. They repeat again and again across wars and continents: singular disappearance, mysterious occurrence, fate unknown. Different tongues, different soldiers, different ages, but the same fragile language, words that stand on the edge of silence, refusing to say more. Some scholars call it psychology hallucinations, born of trauma stories invented to make sense of senseless killing. Shadows made into serpents. Grief turned into ghosts. Perhaps, but others, those who have walked the fogged ravines of Chickamauga, those who have stood on the ridges of Gettysburg at twilight, those who have listened to the silence of Gallipoli. They tell another story. They believe battlefields do more than kill men. They believe battlefields awaken something. At Chickamauga, it takes the shape of a serpent, vast, coiled, gliding through the mist. At Gettysburg, it wears the face of a lost soldier asking for water. At Shiloh, it is the light beneath the earth. At Gallipoli, it is the regiment that marched into clouds and never returned. Different masks, different forms, yet the same terror. The Serpent of Chickamauga is not just a Southern legend. It belongs to a larger motif, a thread woven through history itself. Wherever blood falls in torrents, wherever death comes in multitudes, the veil thins. And something stirs in the fog, in the ravines, in the silence after the guns. The fragments alone are unsettling. But when gathered together, when read one after another, they begin to breathe. They form not just scattered accounts, but a pulse, a rhythm, a chilling pattern that refuses to be ignored. And it is in this accumulation, this piling of contradictions and silences, that the legend of Chickamauga's serpent reaches its most terrifying crescendo. Take the letter of Private James Weaver. Torn, water-stained, barely legible in places. He describes a fog rolling in from the creek, but he insists it moved against the wind. He writes of his comrade Henry, stepping forward, vanishing into the gray veil. Then, a sound. Not musket fire, not the crack of a branch, but a hiss. Long, low, and deep, as though it came from the earth itself. The next line trails off, blurred, smeared by what looks like the pressure of a shaking hand. And beneath it, scratched with such force, the nib of his pen almost tore the paper, a single word: serpent. Or consider the diary of Lieutenant Jonathan Kells, a Confederate officer. His handwriting is precise, methodical, until the pages of September 19th. There his tone shifts. He notes finding impressions in the soil broad and sweeping, as if something immense had passed through. He underlines the phrase "too wide for boot or hoof." Later he confesses in the margin, "The men are unsettled. They speak of a monster. I laugh at them, but truthfully. I too heard the hiss last night." 2 days later, the diary ends abruptly. The remaining pages are blank. His fate unrecorded, his silence enduring. There are rumors, too, of artifacts that briefly surfaced, then disappeared. A shed skin, pale and translucent, supposedly stretched across the brush near Kelly Field, longer than any wagon, thicker than any man could lift. A Union captain is said to have ordered it cut and sent north. But no trace of it survives in any official archive. No sample, no photograph. Only the whispers of men who swore they saw it, and the ghost of a line in one regimental report. An object of great curiosity was recovered and forwarded to headquarters. Forwarded, but never seen again. The testimonies contradict each other, and yet they intertwine. One soldier recalls eyes glowing in the fog like lanterns, but too far apart to belong to a man. Another dismisses the serpent entirely, calling it the madness of war. Yet both accounts appear side by side in the archives written by men who stood on the same ground on the same night. One saw nothing. One saw too much. And between them, silence. Why do so many official reports end in vagueness or not at all? Why the repeated use of phrases that skirt the edges of clarity, mysterious occurrence, singular disappearance? The men could not be found. Why does the handwriting break off mid-sentence? Why do so many pages end in smudges, stains, abrupt stops, as if their authors were interrupted, silenced or afraid to put more into words? Then there are the objects left behind, stark in their finality. Muskets found still loaded, bayonets bent at impossible angles. Canteens dropped into the mud as if abandoned mid-step. A quartermaster's inventory notes a cartridge box pried open. Cartridges scattered around it, its owner never seen again. The report ends coldly. Equipment recovered. The men could not be found. And what of the soldiers themselves, years later, Men who returned home from Chickamauga often spoke freely of tactics, of victories and defeats, of commanders praised or cursed. But when asked about the ravines, their voices faltered. Some changed the subject. Others grew pale eyes distant. A few muttered only a single word: the Serpent, before falling into uneasy silence. This is the climax of the story. Not a single sighting, not one spectacular encounter, but a chorus of vanishings, impressions, and testimonies fractured by fear. A pattern that repeats until denial becomes impossible. Men lost without trace, impressions too vast to explain, fog that moved against the wind, hissing that silenced even the birds, diaries abandoned mid-sentence, letters that trail off into nothing, reports censored or misplaced. And at the core of it all, the same whisper, always the same whisper, that in the ravines of Chickamauga, something vast moved with purpose, something coiled, something alive. The silence around it is more frightening than the stories themselves. For in war, soldiers are trained to record death, to catalog wounds, to measure loss. And yet here in Chickamauga's soil, they found themselves writing not of death, but of disappearance. Not of the enemy they could see, but of something they could not. And even now, when you stand in those ravines at dusk, when the fog rolls low and the cicadas fall silent, it is said you can still hear it. A hiss that rises from nowhere, a vibration in the ground, a sound that does not belong, a sound that reminds you Chickamauga keeps its secrets. And some of those secrets are still moving. The guns fell silent at Chickamauga. The armies moved on. The war raged for 2 more bloody years. Yet something lingered in those ravines long after the last musket fired. Something that did not march away with Rosecrans or brag. When survivors returned home, they carried with them scars and stories. They spoke freely of the horror of combat, of comrades cut down in rows of the chaos and smoke. But when conversation turned to the ravines, voices dropped. Eyes grew distant. Some refused to speak at all. Others whispered of the Serpent. A few wrote letters decades later, confessing what they could not admit in uniform, that Chickamauga was haunted not only by the dead, but by something older, larger, alive. In Tennessee, a veteran told his grandchildren he had once seen 2 lanterns in the fog side by side, but they blinked like eyes. In Kentucky, another claimed he still heard the hiss in his dreams, a hiss that woke him in sweat even 50 years later. One soldier interviewed at the turn of the century refused to describe what he had seen, only muttering, "It was not the war that terrified me. It was the ground beneath it." By the early 20th century, folklore and history merged. Locals around Chickamauga battlefield told visitors of the guardian serpent. Tourists spoke of hearing rustling in the brush, though no animal appeared. Paranormal investigators later reported recording hissing sounds, low and steady on nights when fog blanketed the ravines. Rangers, when pressed, admitted off-record that people often report something moving larger than any man in the corner of their eyes. The motif stretches further. At Gettysburg, ghost tours speak of phantom soldiers who walk Devil's Den. At Shiloh, stories of will-o'-the-wisps rising from the blood-soaked ground still circulate. At Gallipoli, the legend of the Phantom Regiment is retold, as if history itself could not bury it. Different wars, different continents, yet the echoes remain. Disappearances, apparitions. The feeling that the battlefield belongs not just to the fallen, but to something watching, something waiting. And so the Serpent of Chickamauga becomes part of a larger pattern. A deep bridge connecting across time and place. A reminder that war leaves more than graves, it leaves mysteries. That where multitudes die in sudden violence, the veil thins and something crosses through. Whether serpent ghost or vanishing regiment, the form may change, but the terror is the same. Perhaps the serpent is only one mask, Perhaps Chickamauga's ravines, Gettysburg's rocks, Shiloh's woods, Gallipoli's clouds all belong to a single motif. A motif that whispers death awakens more than memory. It awakens watchers. And so the question lingers unanswered, echoing. Was the serpent only the fevered dream of broken soldiers? Or was it real? And if real, what else stirs beneath the fields where thousands lie? The battlefield of Chickamauga lies quiet now. The trees grown thick, the ravines covered in moss and leaves. Visitors walk the marked trails, read plaques about strategy and sacrifice, and stand before monuments carved in stone. But there are things the plaques do not mention, things the stones do not tell. Whispers still hang in the air, carried on the fog cloud that rolls low across the ground. Some say it is only memory trauma echoing across generations. Others insist it is something more. That the serpent of Chickamauga still moves when the mist is heavy, sliding unseen through the gullies, waiting for nightfall. The stories have never died. They have only grown quieter, woven into the soil itself. And what is most unsettling is how the legend fits the pattern. Gettysburg, Shiloh, Gallipoli. Again and again, battlefields scarred by slaughter give birth to mysteries that cannot be explained away. Perhaps it is superstition, perhaps it is psychology, or perhaps something does awaken when too much blood stains the earth. Stand in Chickamauga at dusk, when the cicadas fall silent, when the fog creeps low, and you may feel it too. The weight of silence, the sense of being watched, the shiver in the ground, as if the earth remembers. Some who walk there swear they hear it still, that low hiss, steady and patient. Not wind, not water, something else. If it is only legend, why do the diaries break mid-sentence? Why do reports end in silence? Why do the words mysterious occurrence and fate unknown appear again and again across the archives? The serpent's truth remains buried in the ravines, coiled in fog, hidden in the hush of history. Was it only fear given shape, or did Chickamauga awaken something vast, ancient, and alive? The question is left to you. When you walk the fields of old battle, when you hear stories of vanishings, when the fog closes around your steps, what do you believe waits in the silence? This was another case file, another shadowed story left unresolved. If you wish to hear more, to walk deeper into the archives of the unexplained, subscribe and return with us again. Because Chickamauga is only one name among many. And wherever men wage war, the fog remembers.